Kia ora tātou. Welcome to Ngā Kōrero Mō Te Wā Ki Te Miki Mai o Te Mautauranga, Conversations on the Future of Education. I'm Derek Wenmoth, your host, and with me today is Ewan Mcintosh. We're exploring this delightfully provocative idea that the future of education has little to do with the future.
We will. Oh well, tēnā koe, Ewan. It's such a pleasure having you on. Our relationship goes back many years now, and so having an opportunity to talk to you about the future of education, I know you're brimming with ideas. I look forward to that. But look, for people who listen into this podcast, great to just hear a little bit from you. What's been your journey to where you are now? How did you get to where you are?
It started in Auckland, keynoting a conference that you organised. Genuinely. So the first time I ever spoke in front of a group of people about ideas I had about education was at a core education conference in Auckland under the Sky Tower, I
That's
think it was
right.
called.
Yeah, yeah.
And I had a 2 week old baby with me who is now in first year at university. So that was 18 and a half years ago.
Wow.
And um, the thing, I mean, I got into huge trouble at that conference as well. I don't know if you remember why. I picked on without knowing that half the audience were really keen on this thing called brain gym. I'd picked on it, saying it was pseudoscience, which has since been proven to be, but managed to rankle people. And I realized that people are so anchored on ideas around education to the point they can sometimes become blinkered to other ideas that come in. And a lot of folk have quite set ideas about what good practice is, or at least they did 18 and a half years ago. And so for the past 18 and a half years or so, I've done my best to introduce combinations often of ideas that have existed since time and eternity, to bring them together in new ways to help people see the world in a different way. And I started NoTosh shortly after that in the tail end of 2009, early 2010. NoTosh is Scots for no nonsense, and it was to cut through that jargon
Yep.
and the bureaucracy and the kind of pseudo intellectual conservatism that masks quite often a lack of understanding of what people are actually trying to achieve. I wanted to cut through all of that and give simple ideas that people could use to improve the environment in their classroom, in their school, in their town or city, in their country. And that took me to working with schools all around the world. And today we work in over 70 countries, helping schools with their strategy, with their learning design and the design of their learning environment, and also to government. And at the moment, we're working on a brilliant, fascinating contract trying to help change the way government works in Scotland,
Oh,
across the board, not just in education, but in health, in children and families, in justice. And it all comes from the same place that organizations, schools in particular, do not suffer from a lack of imagination, but I think more and more people do suffer from overload. Too many priorities, too many initiatives being pulled, whiplashed round to think about their job in a completely different way every time a new government comes in. And there are too many things that sound worthwhile competing for the same time, the same energy, and the same attention. And it's no wonder that people feel strung out by that. And
I'm,
I'm
I'm
hoping that hope that I can bring a little bit of an aspirin to that headache.
Oh, well, let's see if you can do that now, Ewan, because I mean, I'm a great admirer of what you've actually done since then. You're one of the few that's taken the bull by the horns and made the difference that I think we need to see. But you triggered in my mind there that idea of how we maintain the idea of the macro and the micro, and this is what so many educators get tied up in. And I'm interested in your thoughts on how that might happen when we consider. I was just reading the other day, for instance, the work of Amy Webb, Futures Today Institute. They've
Mhm.
produced what I think is a wonderful report year on year, just sort of where the signals are and so forth. But I read just last week they've stopped that. They've published their last Futures Today report, and they've set up a whole new one that came out this year called the Convergence Report, because what they've identified is kind of what you were hinting at, is that the change that we're facing and the solutions, more importantly, that we need to be looking for don't just come by isolating one particular thing and focusing exclusively on it. Life is much more complex than that. And so we need to understand where the convergence is between some of
Yeah.
the ideas.
You see that,
What are your thoughts?
well, you see that in the way that you see it in the way government works. So you look at what's going on at the moment in New Zealand in terms of we'll just take education. I think you could take any department in government, and generally what happens is they get given budget. It starts with budget.
Yeah, budget.
So, here's the budget. How are we going to spend it? And then people who are generally middle class, white, and quite often male, who have a really strange idea of what day to day life is like for everyone else, will
Mm,
come up with ideas on what that policy should be and where the money should be spent. And so I think that what I've been going on and on and on about for at least the last 16 years is taking a much more human centered or citizen centered approach to things. Um, Learner centered when you work in education, actually, not just learner centered, also teacher centered. So
yes.
choosing choosing really a person, having a person in mind to start with, thinking about the challenges that they're facing day in, day out, and start from there. And when you do that, you suddenly realize that the challenges that they are facing are very rarely defined by the budget that goes to a specific department. Education is a great example because
Mm,
the most challenged students in our systems generally are not challenged simply because of an educational thing. They're challenged because they're in a sole parent family and mum is leaving at 5 a.m. to go to the cleaning job in the morning. So they're having to feed their younger brothers and sisters. No wonder they're late to school. No
yeah.
wonder they've not done their homework. Also, in the evening, mum or dad is holding down the second job because the poorest in society also have the most antisocial hours. They're not working 9 till 5. They're working either end of the day. School is designed for people who work 9 to 5. It's child minding for the intellectual. And so what ends up happening is that our most challenged learners end up doubly challenged and doubly penalised because they're acting as carers, as pseudo parents essentially for siblings, as well as trying to do school. If you look at that as a particular challenge, it's not just an education thing. It's about childcare expenses. It's about the nature of work for these people. Sometimes it's actually less beneficial for these parents to be working quite as much, and it would be better to have a
Mm,
universal income so that they can afford to have one job instead of three. And that would then resolve a whole bunch of issues around those most challenging kids. And then the behavioural challenges that they bring into the classroom and the behavioural challenges that they bring onto the street in the evening at the weekend. So there's a lot wrapped up by the fact that we look at policy the wrong way round. And
mm,
then I know a lot of people maybe listening to this are not in policy, they're leading schools, leading a department in a school, or they're teaching a class.
mm,
But it's the same when you start with the learners in your class and you design for those children, not the ones you had last year and not the ones you might have next year.
yeah.
You realize the nuance that's required to engage each and every one of them. And the risk is that I was a high school teacher with 180 kids a week. You're not really personalizing 180 times over. What you are trying to do is get very clear on what it is you're trying to achieve with those young people. Clear and simple. That's really hard in today's context where a lot of wordage is thrown at educators about what we could and should do, best practices, what the future holds, what the outside world holds, is presented to us in annual reports, in weekly newsletters, in daily updates through social media. No wonder there's this sense of overwhelm. So, what I try and do is help people gain massive clarity, singular clarity on what it is they're trying to achieve so they can see the noise for what it is and really carve out the signal that's important to them and then stick with that. And it de-stresses them, leads to clearer outcomes for their kids, and it leads to a slightly simpler life for them.
I just totally love what you're saying about that human-centered design, which I know is a key part of you. And I think I'm interested your thoughts though because when I talk about that in a number of situations I've been where I've been asked to talk to groups about the work I do in learner agency, for example, it becomes interpreted as, like you say, I've got 180 kids through the week. How do I individualize a lesson for 180 kids? And I'm saying it's the wrong view of agentic behavior. Agentic behavior is, or the agency we're wanting to give kids has a lot more to do with sharing the ownership of the learning with them. Do they
Yeah.
understand why they're learning? Do they have some options around how they learn and who they learn with, for example?
And I think that one of the greatest barriers is actually a lack of confidence on the part of the educator as to whether the students in a class could cope with being given more responsibility. And I mean, you see some brilliant practice, particularly in the international schools in which I work. They're often IB schools, International Baccalaureate. And with the International Baccalaureate comes a lot of professional development baggage that you have to undertake. You can't, you just wouldn't get away with trying to teach that curriculum without an understanding of it. And a lot of it is wrapped up in skills development of young people. And it really starts from the early years all the way through primary school into secondary. And in Scotland, the equivalent would be the meta skills progression framework. You can Google that and it will come up. And the meta skills are they're meta because they're evergreen, that no matter what the world throws at us, no matter what AI does tomorrow, these are 12 skills that have been identified actually through the economic agency, not the education agency. 12
Okay.
skills they've identified as being absolutely essential within three categories. So there's self-management, social intelligence, and innovation. And within each of those, there are four of these meta skills. So self-management, when I say these, you'll recognize them with all the mobile phone debates that are going on in schools
Mm.
at the moment. The first one is focusing. What does it mean to focus? What does it mean to adapt? What does it mean to have integrity and show that integrity in your work? What does it mean to take the initiative? And then on innovation, you've got things like the skills around curiosity. So, can students ask really good questions? The fact is, most students don't get taught how to ask good questions. 18 and a half years ago, that was one of the things that I put in my talk. It's kind of the simplest thing you can do to increase learner agency is, first of all, learn yourself how to ask a better question, but teach them how to ask great questions. That leads to critical thinking, because when you ask those kinds of questions that are ungoogleable, you have to go off, not to Google, you have to go off and read books and watch films and speak to people and make sense of it. So sense making is a huge part. And then once you've made sense of the world, what are you going to do with it? Creativity. So that's what innovation is. These skills don't go down with the changes in the world around us. They need to be amplified, if anything. So I think that my starting point for user-centered design or learner-centered design is that whoever the user or whoever the learner is, they need to be able to pick up these skills, need to be
Mm.
taught or told these skills so they have the wherewithal to cope with the world around them. When you look at the learners who suffer most, who disengage the most, they often lack some of these meta skills. They can actually be really competent in a discipline or in a subject, and flail completely in the next. And it's largely because the skills that underpin that thinking are not solid, they're not there.
So I'm really curious, Ewan, in your work, how you address what I find in a number of the areas, particularly in New Zealand, where when you're talking about things like those skills. I mean, in the New Zealand curriculum, we've had our core competencies or key competencies have been at the heart of our curriculum for a couple of decades or more now. But over and over, there's this bias in the system that says, well, the more important thing is what's going to get measured. There's an exam score, there's all of this sort of stuff. And so the emphasis on those critical areas that I personally would agree with you about tends to sort of get left more to chance, who the teacher is that might pick that up versus the one who's less secure about that and just focusing on the exam
Yeah.
score at the end of the year. How do you address that in the work you do?
Well, I think when I look at the development of meta skills, there are a few schools that I was working with quite closely in Scotland during the pandemic as they had started to implement ideas around teaching these to very young children, primary one. So you're talking kind of 4 or 5
Oh,
years old. and then creating a continuum through their primary school. So one of my favourites, who I think were ahead of the game at the time, and I need to catch up with them and see how they've taken it further, but it's Crown Primary in Inverness, which couldn't be further away from some of the folk who will no doubt listen to this in New Zealand. What they had created was really good. It was a huge effort, and there were two teachers, two lead teachers who had taken the lead on this. They had put a disproportionate effort, energy, and time into creating that curriculum, think of skills, thinking about how to train their colleagues in that, thinking about the resources that would be required. I call that level two thinking. So you can think of a three-level building. Level two is that ambitious kind of new thing that we've got to put a little bit of discretionary effort into learning and using. Over time, it goes down the stairs to level one. It just becomes business as usual. It becomes the way we do things. So if I'm a new teacher entering their school, it might take me a couple of months of disproportionate effort to learn how we do things here, including those meta skills, but that's just the way we do things. So I'm bumping into it every day. I'm seeing teachers do that every day. That's the way we do things. I fear that when both politicians but also schools make a thing a priority, that it's made a priority without ever giving thought as to how this is going to become routine and habit, how it's going to be knocked down from being a priority on level two to being a habit on the shop floor on level one that people just do. And it's a big effort to do that. I think it takes about 3 or 4 years of concerted effort before that kind of thing becomes an institutional habit. And it takes about 2 years to get 80% of the way there. So when we're working with schools, we often see this really sharp uptake. People are keen, enthusiastic, and you get most people using most of the ideas most of the time. Year 3 and 4 is the hard one, where you've got to lead by reminding as people get distracted by the latest shiny thing that they saw at a conference. And that's where you need to have committed to paper or digital paper. You need to have committed that practice. Today, you've got lesson planning and curriculum mapping software like Toddle, and there's a lot of
A
different ones
lot.
out there. Increasingly, they have the ability to upload any of this kind of written framework stuff that you might have. Now, traditionally, writing a framework for learning meta skills would sit in a PDF and a C drive somewhere and be forgotten about. But now that really rich content can be uploaded as a customized AI prompt, essentially, for every lesson that every educator in the school is planning. So no matter how scrappy your thinking about your lesson to come is going to be, it's still going to spit back at you a really solid lesson structure that is leading by reminding. It's throwing in those meta skills that you should be developing to learn that content. I totally empathize with educators who have far too many standards to follow, too many things to remember to do. Who's going to remember 12 meta skills? I can barely remember 4 of them. Well, if you have that kind of technology backing up your curriculum design, you don't have to remember quite so much. And that's a great way, instead of having a deputy head teacher leading by reminding, going around moderating and giving comments and bits of lesson observations, you can actually make it a day-to-day thing because the technology is doing that leading by reminding for you.
So you've touched on an important thing there when we're in the current age talking about the future of education. AI seems to be one of those things that surfaces pretty quickly in forums I'm part of with educators, with communities, and so forth. So how do you address the concerns that come when you're introducing something like you just have about what this does for the teaching profession? Is this just abdicating responsibility? Is this actually de-skilling teachers or creating an environment where they're no longer required? I mean, how do you address that? How do you beat that up?
I don't think it does that. I think it enhances the practice of a great teacher. Um, we use AI, like I say, that no matter how good a teacher you are, no matter how good a consultant you are or a leader you are, no one's memory is that good. No one can take on board everything that we know makes good practice and at your fingertips bring it to the moment. You'll bring some of it, but it's like the tip of the iceberg. So what we find is in our planning in particular, AI can remind us of things that we'd otherwise forgotten about. It can bring back strategies that we got bored with. But actually, that class has never experienced that before. And it's the perfect thing to increase their skill set. So I don't see it as disempowering. Where it becomes disempowering is where you're just lazy and you're a lazy thinker. So if you're literally taking what it gives you without any thought and then wonder why it feels flat, that's because you're not applying yourself, but using it as a tool to remind yourself of all the good stuff that you've got, all that wealth of pedagogy, wealth of planning expertise. The other thing is, no teacher is an island. So if I'm in a school with 20 other teachers, a small school, 20 other teachers, if I can benefit from the learning and teaching strategies that have worked for them because the curriculum planner's suggesting their strategies to me, well, that's just saved me $2,000 of a PD day plus all the staff time. I remember once being in Nelson, and there were 85 pretty senior educators in a room with me for a day looking at learner agency. And I did the maths based on average salaries for how much that day cost, not in my fee, which was beautifully modest at the time. And I didn't count the sandwiches at lunch, just their time. And it was $85,000 worth
Yeah. Yeah.
of time sat in that room. What a heck of a waste, given that in those days, a day of PD, potentially 10% of what's shared will actually go into day-to-day practice. With AI, you can guarantee that 100% of the smarts of the school is at least suggested in the curriculum planning. And that's a very good return on the investment.
It is. It is. So, I mean, if you were giving some advice, particularly thinking about, say, principals or senior leaders in a school today, and they were having to weigh up a lot of the things that are being thrust upon them. For example, I'm thinking here in New Zealand, some conversations I've just had this week where a senior leadership team in a school were having quite desperate arguments among themselves, really, about having to lay aside a whole lot of things so they could focus very specifically on meeting the nationally mandated targets around literacy levels and numeracy levels. You know, where's your start point, or what would be your advice to principals or
So
senior leaders? Where do they start?
maybe three things in sequence that we were worth thinking about. The first is this myth that clarity shrinks creativity. That somehow to be creative, we've got to keep adding things and have a rich palette on which to draw. It really doesn't. And people sometimes hear the word strategy or national policy, and they imagine this kind of narrowing of things, a tidying up, a
Mm-hmm.
kind of a bureaucratic haircut for
Yeah.
bold thinking, And I think the opposite's true. Now, I'm not saying that I agree necessarily with the way that the New Zealand government does its policy. I'm also on a visa for my visit, so I have to be very careful in what I say. But what I would say is that you can take any narrow policy from a government, and you can actually use it as a really powerful
Yeah.
tool. And I would ask people to bear with me at this point because they might be going, "Are you serious?" But I am. The first thing is, of all the things that you're currently doing that feel creative, powerful, that are creating the kind of environment you want in your school, is any of it business as usual? Is any of it a routine habit? Is any of it on level one? If it's not, then it probably should be. So, step one, I would actually say we're not ignoring what policy has come down, but we really need these practices to be embedded and to be routine. And so, the first thing I would do is audit all the things and see which of these are genuinely adding value, in our opinion, and what's it going to take for that to become routine. And I've gone as far as literally printing out Harvard Project Zero thinking routines and putting them in a shoebox for every teacher in the school so they bloody well use them.
Yep.
Because we've done the PD and then nobody uses it. Well, it's because they forgot. So let's go old school. Shoebox, A5, PDFs of these thinking routines. And when you're stuck or when you're bored, pick one out and try it with your class. That's one way of beginning to embed practices as business as usual. Second thing, are you really clear as a school on what you're trying to achieve already? And is that completely misaligned with the government policy that's coming down? I think you would find actually most schools will find that there is an element of what they're doing that is aligned to government policy. So when government says we really need to improve our literacy and numeracy, that can be seen as massively narrowing. But essentially, it's a choice that's been made for schools. It's a choice that says we really want you to improve in this area. They're not telling you how to do it, but they are saying we want to find ways to improve in this particular area. That takes me to the second point, which is good strategy always starts with making a choice. Now, the reason that your school teams feel that they're having to ditch a lot is because a lot of school plans of SIPs or annual plans, school improvement plans,
Yep,
they're
yep,
really just catalogues of stuff. They're
yeah,
catalogues of good intentions. They've got lists of activities that need to be undertaken. But strategy is about choosing. You've got to be prepared to choose. Who are we really operating for? Name the people that you're working for. And are there two or three different segments of students in particular that you are there trying to support? What problem are we best placed to solve where we are?
mhm,
And what are we going to, as a school, what are we not going to prioritize right now? So when you look at this, you might say we're going to try and first of all knock things into business as usual. Let's see what's left over and ask ourselves, do we really want to fight the fight of prioritizing these things now?
yep,
Or actually, can we prioritize these later and focus on literacy or numeracy if we feel actually that's going to serve the young people that are there? And then the third part is saying no is what leadership is all about. So, one of the hardest things, particularly for ambitious leaders and for generous school leaders, is to say no to things that feel worthwhile.
yeah,
The problem is that most stuff that schools do feels worthwhile, and you can't do it all. You're not doing it all well anyway. And I think that that would be the hard discussion is that you've got all these worthwhile things in your plan, but it's really hard. It's really hard for a school to say, yeah, we're doing all of these things equally amazingly already. You've got to choose between them. So I would say, yeah, you do have to probably drop some of the stuff that you're doing, but not because you don't ever want to do it. More that you're able then to concentrate on one or two things and do them really well. And I think that if you're looking at learner agency, for example, if you really want students to be capable of thinking for themselves and you want them to be able to read and be good at maths and number work, that's totally feasible.
sure.
One learner agency is not at odds with really good literacy skills and really good numeracy skills. But yeah, you probably can't do the other nine things that were on your to-do list. And that's maybe not a bad thing because by not doing those nine things, you're going to get really good at learner agency.
Right.
And then you can pick one of the other nine things next year, the year after.
Yeah. Look, those three things I think are going to resonate and stick well with listeners to this blog. I think just looking at our time, we could go on for ages, and I know you're going to get another chance to talk with a New Zealand audience in a few weeks, which I'll be circulating on the newsletter. I wonder whether you want to just sort of round off here. If I said to you, what would some of your or a key thought about the future of education? I sense you're always, since I've known you, a bit of an optimist when it comes to this, but what do you see on that horizon that we should really be taking notice of?
So you used to write a report every year with 10 things.
Yep.
And it was interesting because I read that every year. And I think the last 3 years, the 10 things began to be quite often the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what was interesting is the 10 things revolved around one idea, which was kind of whatever the future throws at us, we have to be able to think for ourselves. We have to be, there is a word, discerning. And discernment's an interesting word. It's almost jargony for a lot of people because it's not a word you would use every day. And as someone whose firm is called NoTosh, no nonsense, I try not to use jargon, but discernment's probably the perfect word for this. I think that the future if I were the head of a school or head of learning and teaching or just the head of my class, the thing I would want my young people to learn is the skill of discernment,
Mm.
which is working out whether something is worth paying attention to or not, and whether something that we dislike hearing has any element of truth or any element of point of view that is worth taking, holding on to for a moment, and trying to understand. And I think that discernment is really the key to being able to take some of the hateful bile that is in the world and nonetheless make sense of where it's coming from. And it's vital to make sense of the sheer quantity of media that we are bumping up against every day. It's also important for the adults in the room when you are being bombarded with educational ideas, political ideas, and research masquerading as research. Discernment is the number one skill to be able to work out how to filter that quickly and effectively. And like I was just saying, one of the biggest traps in schools is that almost everything sounds worthwhile.
Yeah.
And that's exactly why focus is so hard for people to have. That's why strategy is not focus. So you're not usually choosing between a good idea and a bad idea. You're choosing between lots of pretty good, all right ideas that can't really all be done well at once.
Yeah.
So discernment is also key for any leader in terms of helping your community make a choice as to what you're going to focus on. So I wouldn't look too much about the future that's being thrust upon you, but I would look at the future in terms of what you're able to develop within yourself as probably the most important skill for the next 5 years at the very least.
I couldn't agree more. In fact, as you're listening, I was speaking, at least, and I was listening, it occurred to me that perhaps that's the new title for someone responsible in a school as a chief discernment officer. Huh? We
Love
could
it.
promote that idea, Ewan.
It's worth it.
It is.
But I really appreciate the chance as well to this. I'm coming to the Stonefields Trust it's a free event. The tickets are almost sold out. I don't know how you sell out a free event, but they're almost sold out. Stonefields Trust is just in the southern part of Auckland, and it's the first time in ages, in 12 years, that I've come to New Zealand. And I wanted to do this event for free as a way to reconnect with people that I've worked with online but never met, and a way to perhaps make some new friends, new educational friends in the area. None of this is done alone. And I think that in New Zealand, as in Scotland, it can sometimes feel that we're small countries that are quite far away from where the action sometimes is. And I would say doing these things together is so important. The small countries where everyone knows each other are also a brilliant way to make ideas spread fast.
Absolutely. Well, let's make that happen, Ewan. I fully appreciate you giving me this time, and I hope that people who listen to this might be motivated to join the webinar when it comes up and to discover more about the work that you're doing with NoTosh, because I know you publish lots on your website. I follow that as well. So appreciate again, and wish you well. Travel safe. We'll be in touch when you arrive here.
Thanks a lot. See you all soon.
Ka kite.